Hello everyone on the channel. What I'm going to tell you happened to me when I was 15. So it was a long time ago, but I remember every detail as if it were yesterday. I wanted to forget. I tried to forget. But some things just don't want to be left behind. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, my mother and I took refuge at Memorial Medical Center, one of the few places still standing as the city sank. My mother was a nurse and decided to stay to help the patients. I didn't want to stay, but I had no choice. The hospital was old, dark, the hallways stifling with heat and the smell of mold. When the electricity went out, the place got even worse. The windows were boarded up, the lights flickered, and the only sound other than the storm outside was the sound of people suffering in makeshift beds. But there was something else, something that no one wanted to admit. On the second night without power, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was a patient calling for help. But the sound came from the empty hallways, the flooded floors, the abandoned rooms. I tried to ignore it, but every time I walked past the stairs, I felt a presence, a cold that didn't match the suffocating heat of the hospital. I saw shadows moving across the glass doors, but whenever I looked, no one was there. Then a woman disappeared. She was a nurse like my mother. They said she fell into the water while trying to leave the building, that she was swept away by the current. But that night, someone knocked on the cafeteria door, 3 slow, heavy knocks. One of the doctors opened it, but there was no one there. Just the darkness of the flooded hallway and a trail of wet footprints leading to the elevator that hadn't worked for days. My mother tried to calm me down, saying I was tired, that it was all stress. But then came the third night. That's when the hospital got really quiet. It wasn't the normal silence of the early morning. It was something wrong, dense, a vacuum in the air. People noticed. An elderly patient who had been unconscious since the flood began suddenly opened his eyes and mumbled something that no one understood. Then he began to scream, "They're here." No one knew what to do. The man ripped the wires out of his arm and pointed to the door of the room, his eyes wide with pure terror. "Don't let them in," he screamed, but no one knew what he was talking about. Then the lights flickered, and the hallway was no longer empty. There, standing among the stretchers and broken equipment, was a man. Tall, thin, soaked to the bone. His skin looked wrinkled as if he had been submerged in water for a long time. But the worst thing was his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. There were only dark holes where they should have been, and even without a face, I knew he was looking at me. My mother grabbed my arm tightly, pulling me back. Someone tried to turn on a flashlight, but the batteries died. The old man in the bed kept screaming. "Close the doors," one of the doctors yelled, and everyone started moving, pushing chairs, blocking stretchers, anything to block the entrance. But when I looked back down the hallway, the man was gone. It was at that moment that I realized something even worse. The hospital was sinking. Not like a building being taken over by water, but like the entire structure was sinking into something that shouldn't be there. The walls seemed farther away, the hallways longer, the sounds muffled, the floor shook beneath my feet, and a horrible smell began to spread through the air. A smell of old, rotten, of something that had been dead for a long time. It was then that I heard the voice of the nurse who had disappeared. She called my name, and it came from the flooded floor. Her voice called to me from the flooded floor, low, weak, suffocated by the rotten smell that spread through the hospital. My entire body went cold. The nurse had disappeared 2 days ago, washed away by the floods, and now I heard her voice coming from the darkness as if she had never left. My mother held my arm tightly. The hallway in front of us seemed longer, as if the hospital were stretching out around us. The sounds muffled, as if we were underwater without realizing it. The awake patients began to murmur restlessly, as if they felt the change in the air. The old man who had been screaming before now only shook his head, muttering, "Too late, too late." We heard a sound coming from the elevator. A slow knock, another, and another. Someone in the group screamed. A doctor ran to lock the doors, but before he could, the lights flickered and the elevator opened by itself. And there, in the darkness, She was. The nurse everyone thought was dead, but it wasn't her anymore. Her body was soaked, her skin pale and wrinkled, her eyes empty like the man who had appeared before. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a spray of dirty water, as if she were rotting inside, as if she had become part of the flood. My mother pulled me back with all her might, and the group panicked. People ran to the rooms, locked the doors, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She looked at me, and even without a mouth I heard her voice inside my head. "The hospital is sinking. You shouldn't be here." The ground shook, the lights flickered again, and when they came back on, she was gone. But the hospital wasn't the same anymore. The hallways were longer. The walls were peeling, covered in mud. The smell of rot was worse. My mother pulled me into an empty room and locked the door. Inside, we could hear what was happening outside. The sound of footsteps on the water. But no one said anything. Just footsteps, slow, dragging, and a steady drip that seemed to drip from the ceiling. My mother held me against her chest, her heart racing. We stood there, listening, waiting, trying to understand. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. My mother put her hand over my mouth, telling me to be quiet. Then someone breathed on the other side. I felt cold air coming through the crack in the door. I smelled dirty water. I felt my body freeze with fear. And then a voice whispered, "Let the water in." The door latch turned by itself. My mother held it tightly to keep it from opening, but something was pushing on the other side, something that wasn't alive. The doorknob rattled, the hinges creaked, the smell of mold and rot became unbearable. It was then that I looked down at the floor and saw the water rising. At first I thought it was a leak, but it was rising too fast. First to my ankles, then to my knees. The room was filling up as if we were at the bottom of the ocean. My mother tried to scream for help, but there was no one else. The hospital was sinking, and so were we. She looked at me desperately. She grabbed my hand and ran to the window, trying to open it, trying to break it. But everything outside was darkness. The world beyond the glass no longer existed. The water was rising. The door latch clicked. And then the door opened by itself. My mother screamed, and I saw it. They were there, the nurse, the man with no eyes, other patients who had died in the previous days. They all stood in the doorway, staring at us, their mouths open, but not making a sound. Water was pouring out of them, their bodies empty, like shells filled by the storm. My mother pushed me back, trying to protect me, but the nurse's soaked arms grabbed her first. I screamed, but my voice didn't come out, because now I was underwater. The hospital was gone, just a dark ocean, and their hands pulling me under. This is disturbing news. The radio has never lied to me. During Hurricane Katrina, when the streets turned into rivers and the city was swallowed by the storm, it was the radio that kept me sane. I was a volunteer police officer, and as New Orleans sank, I stayed at the station manning communications. The phones were down, the power was out, but the radio was still alive. Voices called for help, officers gave instructions, and I did my best to keep in touch with those who still needed help. But by the third night, the voices had changed. The calls for help were always the same. People trapped on rooftops, people trying to escape from collapsing homes, families who didn't know where to go. But around 3 a.m, a strange transmission began to repeat itself on our frequency. A faint voice, static in between the words, always saying the same thing. "This is Unit 13. I'm trapped. Water rising. I can't get out. Can anyone hear me?" The first time I heard it, I barely paid attention. Another call for help, like so many others. I picked up my pen to write down the location, but the transmission gave no coordinates. It just repeated the same message, the same tone of desperation. "This is Unit 13. I'm trapped. Rising water. I can't get out. Can anyone hear me?" I tried to answer. "Unit 13, this is the headquarters. What's your location?" Silence. I waited a few seconds. I looked at one of the officers who was with me. He shrugged. Then the transmission came back on. This is Unit 13. I'm trapped. Rising water. I can't get out. Can anyone hear me? But something was different. The voice wasn't exactly the same. The tone was lower, more slurred, as if the person on the other end was drowning. The back of my neck prickled. I checked the police station system. There was no Unit 13 in the city. Police radios were numbered and 13 didn't exist. My mouth went dry. One of the officers laughed, saying it was a prank. Some idiot playing with the radio while the city was sinking. But something inside me didn't believe it. The storm raged outside. The wind drove the rain against the windows of the police station, and the whole city looked like a flooded desert. Then the transmission came back. And this time I heard something else in the background. It wasn't just the voice of the officer calling for help. There were other voices, quiet, whispered. But they were there. My stomach turned. The transmission crackled, distorted. The voice scratched, wetter. This is Unit 13. I'm trapped. Water rising. I can't get out. Can anyone hear me? It was then that I noticed something that made my skin go cold. The static, the rising water, the muffled tone of the voice. The transmission wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the water. I looked down at the floor of the police station. Small rivulets of water were running down the walls, dripping from the cracked ceiling, forming puddles at my feet. And then, before I could react, the radio hissed louder, and the voice called my name. My name echoed through the radio, slurred, distorted, as if it were being whispered through the static, through the water. My body froze. I looked around at the officers, waiting for some reaction, but no one seemed to have heard. Only me. The rain hammered on the roof, the station shook with the wind, and the puddles of water on the floor seemed to get bigger. The radio crackled again, the sound crackling over the speaker. This is Unit 13. I'm trapped. Water rising. I can't get out. The same message. But now there was something different about the breathing. Before I could react, the radio crackled loudly and went silent. The entire station seemed to hold its breath. And then, a new sound. Drops dripping onto the floor. I turned my head slowly. The water was rising. The rivulets running down the walls were thicker now. The ceiling was dripping, as if something from upstairs was leaking. But I knew it wasn't just that, because the smell had changed. It wasn't just the smell of rain and dirt anymore. It was the smell of old mud, of stagnant things, of bodies that had been underwater for too long. My skin crawled all over. The other officers were distracted, trying to solve other calls, and I knew if I told them what was happening, they would laugh. So I did the worst thing I could have done. I picked up the radio again. Unit 13, can you still hear me? For a second, there was silence. Then the answer came. Low, hoarse, wet. Yes. My heart raced. The radio crackled again, and the sound that came next made my blood run cold. Footsteps. But they weren't coming from the radio. They were coming from upstairs. I stopped breathing. The entire station had been evacuated. There were only 3 people down here, and no one had come up. But the footsteps kept coming, slow, dragging, wet. Is anyone up there? I asked, trying to sound calm. The sergeant looked at me and frowned. No one's up there, just us. But the footsteps were there, and then the voice on the radio spoke again. They're coming. The line crackled so loudly that I threw the radio on the table. The sound echoed through the station, but no one reacted. No one could hear it but me. I swallowed hard and looked up at the stairs that led to the top floor. The light at the end of the hallway was flickering. The floor was wet. Water was now running down the steps as if something was leaking from the ceiling, or from someone. Then everything went silent, until the upstairs door opened on its own, slowly, sluggishly. My entire body froze. The light flickered again, and for a second I saw a shadow at the top of the stairs. Tall, still, completely soaked. My lungs seized up. My instinct screamed at me not to move. The light flickered again. The shadow was closer, not walking, just closer. The stairs creaked, and then a new voice came from the radio. Different, more than one, several voices speaking at once. Let the water in. The air left my lungs. The smell of rot became unbearable. The shadow moved, and I ran. I raced through the police station, kicking over chairs, bumping into tables. The police officers looked at me blankly, wondering what the hell was going on, but I didn't stop. I reached the exit door and pulled hard, but it was locked. I was shaking all over, pulling the handle with all my strength, but nothing happened. Behind me, I heard the wet footsteps coming. I turned around slowly, and I saw the sergeant, the police officer who was sitting at the reception, another officer I didn't even know, all of them standing still, staring at me, wet. Water dripped from their uniforms, their eyes too deep, too empty. Their mouths weren't moving, but I could still hear the voices inside my head. Let the water in. The light blinked one last time, and everything went dark. You never forget the first time you see a dead body. I was a rescue volunteer after Hurricane Katrina. I spent days navigating the flooded streets of New Orleans, seeing destroyed homes, desperate people, everything covered in that dark, filthy water. But the worst part wasn't the destroyed buildings. The worst part was the silence. The city seemed dead until we found him. It was my third day patrolling the French Quarter. The smell of rot was already unbearable, and we all knew what that meant. The heat was accelerating the decomposition of the bodies that the flood had swept away. And at every corner, we found another one. It was the kind of thing you saw on the news, but never imagined you'd have to face to face. My partner on that mission was a guy named Deshaun, an experienced paramedic. He paddled slowly, his eyes focused on the surface of the water, while I held the flashlight, searching what was left of the city. That's when I saw it. A body floating. The flashlight's reflection illuminated the swollen face, the open, empty eyes, the skin wrinkled from the water. It was a man, maybe 40, wearing a white dress shirt, now covered in dirt and dried blood. Another one, I muttered, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. Deshaun sighed and steered the boat. The idea was to pull the body in and take it for identification, something we had done several times that day. But when he touched the corpse, the man opened his eyes. Deshaun screamed and let go of the body, nearly falling into the water. My heart raced. The corpse didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react, but the eyes were staring at me. Jesus Christ, Deshaun muttered, taking a deep breath. Did you see that? I did. Those empty, swollen eyes were fixed on me. Is he still alive? I asked, even though I knew the answer. It wasn't. The body was too swollen, too stiff. No living person would look like that. But then, he opened his mouth. I swear to God. The lips parted, the jaw cracked, and a dry sound came out of his throat, like air being forced through lungs that no longer existed. Deshaun flinched. My blood ran cold. And then he spoke. A single word, hoarse, wet, broken. Sink. The boat's radio crackled at the same moment, a loud, piercing noise. I nearly fell to the ground in shock. What the hell was that? Deshaun yelled, grabbing an oar as if to defend himself. I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on the body, on that mouth that was still wide open, on the choking sound coming from inside it. Then the body sank on its own, without anyone touching it. He simply slid into the dirty water, being pulled as if something down there wanted him back. We stood there, listening to the radio crackle, the boat engine sputter, the raindrops beginning to fall on the black surface of the flood. I didn't want to look at the water, but I did, and I saw a face down there, eyes wide, mouth open, speaking. The face below was still there, staring back at me. The dark water rippled slightly, but I could see the wide eyes, the mouth open wide, moving as if it were still trying to speak. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in the impossible sight. The boat's radio kept crackling, garbled words emerging from the static, voices cutting off as if someone were trying to speak underwater. Then the engine failed. The boat began to drift. Deshaun grabbed the oar and tried to steady it, but the current was pulling us closer to where the body had sunk. "What the hell are you looking at?" he asked, his voice shaking. I pointed toward the water. He hesitated, then looked. He was silent for a moment, and then he let out a scream. "What the fuck?" Before I could respond, something hit the hull of the boat, hard enough to make us rock. My breath caught in my chest. The radio crackled even louder, and between the cracks I could hear one sentence. "Sink with us." The boat turned sideways. My body was thrown forward. And then I fell into the water. Darkness swallowed me. The world went silent, drowned in a suffocating silence. My arms flailed, trying to swim upward, but something grabbed my ankle, something cold, something dead. Panic took over me. I turned around underwater and saw hands, so many hands, coming out of the darkness, grabbing my legs, pulling my shirt, dragging me under. I tried to scream, but all I did was swallow more water. My lungs burned, my body shook. The current dragged me along, faces appearing around me, white, swollen, their eyes empty, their mouths open and whispering underwater. I no longer knew what was up or down. But then, in the midst of my despair, I saw Deshaun. He was on the surface trying to reach me, and right next to him I saw something else, the body that spoke. He was standing on the water now as if it were solid, his mouth still open, his eyes fixed on me. He raised one hand and pointed downward. The hands pulled me tighter, and I sank. My body was dragged deeper into the darkness, the whispers becoming screams, the water becoming ice, my chest begging for air. And then everything stopped. The hands let go. The water went calm. I opened my eyes and saw it. Myself. My distorted reflection floated in front of me, but it was wrong. My skin was pale, my eyes sunken, my mouth open, saying something I couldn't hear. My vision began to fade. My lungs were giving out, until something pulled me up. The world exploded with light and air as I surfaced. My lungs filled with oxygen, my body shook, and when I looked back at the boat, Deshaun was there, holding my shirt, dragging me in. I fell to the bottom of the boat, coughing, trying to make sense of what had happened, but when I looked back at the water, there was nothing. No body, no hands, just the storm and the distorted reflection of the dark clouds. Deshaun looked at me, panting, his eyes wide. "Let's get out of here." And we did. We never went back. But to this day, when I hear water dripping, sometimes I think I can still hear the voices, whispering, calling my name. If you've ever stepped into an elevator and felt a chill, like something was in there with you, then you might understand a little of what I went through. But I assure you, what happened that night was far worse than any strange sensation. It happened during Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans was sinking and no one knew how many people were dying every minute. I and 3 other volunteers were at the St. Clair Hotel, an old building in the city center, helping to evacuate the few guests who were still trapped. The streets were a dark ocean. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and distant screams mixed with the sound of the storm. But the real horror wasn't outside. I was on the 10th floor. The hotel had already been almost completely evacuated, but we received a final call over the radio. 3 guests were still trapped on the top floor. The main elevator had no power, so we made our way up the stairs, flashlights in hand, stepping through puddles of water that shouldn't have been there. The building shook with every gust of wind, and the smell of mold and rot filled the air. We reached the 10th floor. The hallway was ankle-deep in water. The carpet, soaked through, made disgusting noises with every step. The walls were peeling, and the wallpaper seemed to bubble, like rotting skin. That's when we heard it. Ding. The sound of an elevator arriving at the floor, which didn't make sense. The elevators had been out of service since the hurricane started. We all looked at each other. One of the volunteers, a guy named Luis, shone his flashlight down the hallway. And there it was. The elevator. The doors were open, fully lit, and dry. The entire floor was submerged in dirty water, but inside the elevator, the floor was clean, dry, perfect, as if the hurricane hadn't existed inside. My throat went dry. Something was wrong, very wrong. Luis stepped forward, frowning. "This is really weird," he muttered. Then before anyone could stop him, he was inside. The doors slammed shut. We ran over. We pushed buttons, tried to force the doors open, but the panel wouldn't light up. The button for the ground floor wouldn't work. No response. Then over the radio, we heard Luis's voice. "Hey, what the hell is this?" The transmission crackled, his voice distant, muffled. "Luis?" I yelled into the radio. "Can you hear us? Where did you go?" Silence. Then a static noise. And then his voice again. "I think I went downstairs, but something's wrong. The ground floor is flooded." My stomach turned. The ground floor hadn't been flooded when we'd entered. There was a little water, of course, but nothing that covered the feet. And then Luis whispered, "Someone's here." I looked at the others. No one said anything, but they were all pale. "Luis, get out of here now." Nothing. Then the strangest noise I'd ever heard, the sound of dripping. Luis gasped. "There's water on the ceiling," he said, his voice shaking. I frowned. "What?" "The ceiling is wet. It's dripping." A shiver ran down my spine. And then we heard it over the radio. A voice that wasn't Luis's. Low, wet, choked. "The elevator is already full." The radio died. The floor lights flickered, and on the elevator screen a number appeared. 1. The elevator was going down to a floor that didn't exist. But that floor didn't exist. My mind tried to find some logical explanation. Maybe a fault in the panel, maybe a short circuit due to the water. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was wrong. The radio was still silent. No response from Luis. No static. Just a suffocating silence that made me grip the device tighter, as if that would force it to work. Luis couldn't have just disappeared like that. "We have to get him out of there," one of the volunteers said, his voice shaking. We ran to the stairs and went down to the ground floor, our footsteps echoing in the empty building. But when we got there, the elevator doors were still closed, and the digital screen still showed -1. The ground floor seemed darker than before, more stuffy. The storm raged outside, but here everything seemed still. The smell of mold and rotting wood was worse, and then we heard the knocking, faint, slow, coming from inside the elevator. "Luis." I ran to the panel and pressed all the buttons, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. Then the radio crackled. His voice came out low and shaking. "I'm here. Can you hear me?" I pressed the transmission button, relieved. "Luis, where are you?" Pause. The static cut his breath. I don't know. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to have a floor here." My hair stood on end. "What do you mean?" "There's a hallway. The walls are covered in water. There are leaks. Everything is rotten. And there are doors. Lots of doors. But they're all locked. I tried to press the button to go up, but it doesn't work. The elevator light went out, and there are wet footprints on the floor." The blood ran cold in my veins. Louis started to cry. "I'm not alone." I gripped the radio tightly. "What? The elevator? It went down by itself. I tried to get out, but something ran down the hallway. I saw the shadow. I saw... The transmission cut off. The silence was worse than anything. I turned to the others. One of them was white as a sheet. The other started pressing the emergency button like crazy. But nothing happened. And then, the doors started to open by themselves. A sound of metal creaking echoed through the ground floor. I took a step back, my heart racing. The inside of the elevator was wrong. The floor, once dry and clean, was now soaked. Puddles of dark water spread across the floor. The ceiling dripped, each drop falling to the floor with a slow, suffocating sound. The smell of mold and rot invaded my nostrils. And then we saw it, wet footprints, leaving the elevator, walking along the ground floor, walking behind us. We turned our heads at the same time, and there he was, Luis, standing in the hallway completely soaked. His eyes were too wide, his skin was too white, Water dripped from his clothes, dripped onto the floor, but he didn't shake, didn't breathe. "My God," someone whispered. Luis slowly raised his head, and then he smiled, but his smile was wrong, too wide, too cold. And then he said in a low, wet, wrong voice, "The elevator is already full." The lights flickered, and everything went dark. Anyway, that was my story, and that day was scary. This story I'm going to tell you is very disturbing, so if you don't feel well, get out. Well, when the water started to rise, we ran to the roof. It was me, my mother, and my younger sister, trapped inside our own house while Hurricane Katrina destroyed everything around us. The flood took over the street so fast that we didn't even have time to escape. In a matter of minutes, the ground floor was swallowed up by the muddy water, and the second floor began to fill up as well. The smell of gasoline and rotting trash spread through the air. We had to break the attic window and climb to the roof. From up there, we could see the city sinking. People on top of houses screaming for help, pieces of furniture and bodies floating in the current. There was nothing but the storm and the destruction, or at least that's what I thought, because there was something else on the roof with us. At first, we didn't notice. My mother held my sister in her arms, trying to calm her down, while I looked around, waiting for a rescue boat to appear. But then I felt it, the weight of another presence. The roof creaked. I turned my head slowly, and there he was. A man, standing on the other end of the roof, his back to us. My lungs seized. He hadn't been there when we climbed up, and it didn't make sense that someone would be there without us noticing. My mother saw it too. "Hey," she called, her voice shaking. "Do you need help?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his shoulders slightly hunched as if listening but not intending to turn. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his thin body. His dark hair dripped with water. I took a tentative step forward. "Sir, are you okay?" He moved, but not in the right way. His body shuddered as if he were trying to remember how to move. Then his head slowly turned, but only his head. It turned at an odd, almost impossible angle, until finally his eyes met mine, and I saw it. His eyes held nothing. They were empty. Holes too deep, too black, as if there was nothing inside them but the storm itself. My mother held her breath, and then he smiled, a smile too big for a human face. The storm roared even louder. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and for a second I blinked to shield my eyes. When I looked again, he was gone. My sister began to cry. My mother held my hand tightly. That was when I understood. The roof was no longer safe. We were not alone. And he was still here. Somewhere. The car skidded on the wet road. My fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel. My mind screamed at me not to look in the rear-view mirror, but I looked and saw her standing there in the field, still motionless, still staring, the storm swirling around her without moving a hair. And then Emily spoke again, her voice shaky and low, saying she was coming, saying she wanted to come in. And I felt a chill run up my spine because I knew that no matter how hard I sped up, no matter how fast I ran away, she would always be too close. My wife woke up to the jolt of the car and asked what was wrong, but my mouth was dry and I couldn't answer. My eyes were glued to the mirror, waiting for the next flash of the storm. And when the lightning lit up the road again, she was no longer there in the field. She was closer, now on the shoulder, standing in the mud without sinking, her white dress without a single stain, and I wanted to believe it was a delusion, but Emily whispered, "A father." That made me. I realized that she saw it too, that she knew that it wasn't all in my head. And then came the knocking on the window. 3 dry, low knocks, as if someone wanted to come in without rushing, without urgency, just waiting for me to make the mistake of looking. And then came the voice, low, drawn out, impossible to be swallowed by the sound of the storm, impossible to ignore. "Let me in." My whole body shivered. My wife grabbed my arm, asking who was knocking on the window in the middle of a deserted road in the middle of a hurricane. But I knew I couldn't answer. I knew that if I said it out loud, it would become even more real. So I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and accelerated. I felt the car rock. I saw the streetlights flashing and going out as we passed them, and for a moment I thought we were escaping, that the thing was behind us, but that's when Emily whimpered and pointed to the back seat. My heart almost stopped. In the rearview mirror, I saw the silhouette of someone sitting next to her, still staring forward, eyes too black to be human, skin too white. And then that thing smiled, and before I could react, the car skidded, spun on the road, hit something I couldn't see, and everything became a blur of rain and darkness. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the smell of wet earth and gasoline. My head was pounding. The car was on its side, the doors were open, the storm was raging around us, but there was no sound inside the vehicle, and when I looked at the passenger seat, my wife was gone. When I looked at the back seat, Emily was gone either, and then despair hit me full on. I stumbled out of the car, the mud swallowing my feet, my whole body shaking. I called out to them. I screamed until my throat hurt, but the only sound I heard was the wind, the rain, the empty echo of my own terror. And then, in the middle of the field, between the fog and the darkness, I saw a small silhouette holding a stuffed rabbit, standing still, motionless, looking at me. Emily. My legs moved before my mind could process it. I ran towards her, stumbling, slipping, feeling the cold of the storm soaking my body. But when I got close enough to see her face, something inside me broke. She smiled, a smile that was wrong, too wide, too dark. Let me in. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my chest. That thing was using my daughter's body, but it wasn't her. Her eyes were too deep, too empty, deep like black holes, as if everything I knew was being sucked into them. Then I felt something cold touch my arm. I froze to the bone. I turned my face slowly, breathless, voiceless, and saw my wife beside me, her hair drenched in water, her clothes soaked, her skin pale and dead, her eyes wide and soulless. And when her mouth opened, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a slurred whisper, repeating the same words over and over again. New, let me in, let me in, let me in. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body didn't respond. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The storm was swirling around me. I could feel their presence getting closer, the smell of wet earth and rotten things getting stronger and stronger. And that's when I realized they were never trapped outside. I was the one trapped inside. Hello everyone on the channel. My name is Ryan, and I've been working as a 911 operator for over 10 years. I've answered calls of all kinds: robberies, accidents, rescue requests, and even embarrassing mistakes. But the story I'm going to share today didn't exactly happen to me. It was shared by a former co-worker, an experienced guy who always kept calm in the worst situations. The problem is that after that call, he was never the same again. This happened during Hurricane Milton, a monstrous storm that devastated the East Coast. It was nighttime. The winds were howling like something alive, knocking down poles, ripping off roofs, throwing cars into the air like toys. The phone lines were congested with desperate calls, people trapped in their homes, unexpected flooding, fires caused by broken wires. Absolute chaos. My colleague Mark was already exhausted at that point. He said that the worst part wasn't the number of calls, but the feeling of helplessness. Often, all we could do was tell people to hang in there and wait. But then, around 2 in the morning, he received a different call. One that started like so many others, but gradually turned into a real nightmare. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was that of a child, a boy. He sounded scared, but his breathing was too calm for someone who should have been fleeing a disaster. There's someone in my house. Mark looked at the screen. The caller ID showed a home number from a coastal area that should have already been evacuated. His heart raced. Okay, kid, what's your name? Josh, the voice replied. I'm 8 years old. Josh, are you alone? The silence lasted a bit longer than it should have. Then he answered. My mom is here, but she's sleeping. Something about the way he said that bothered Mark. Can you wake her up, Josh? No. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around, trying to signal for a supervisor, but everyone was overwhelmed. He would have to handle this call alone. Okay, Josh. You said there's someone in your house. Can you see this person now? The answer came in a barely audible whisper. Yes. Mark squinted. The line was static, and the wind howled in the background. He turned up the volume on his headset. Where is this person, Josh? In my window. Mark looked at the clock. The hurricane was at its peak at that moment. Winds nearing 125 miles per hour, torrential rain, flooded streets. There was no way anyone could be outside of a window, not without being swept away by the wind. Josh, listen to me. Is this person inside or outside your house? They're outside, he answered hesitantly. But what? They're not moving. Mark felt his stomach churn. What do you mean, not moving? They're just standing still, looking at me. Mark's heart started pounding faster. He quickly typed to try to locate the caller's house. The storm was ravaging the city, but there might still be time to send a unit. Josh, what does this person look like? Can you describe them to me? The line went silent for a moment, only the sound of the storm. Then, the answer came in a thin voice. He looks like me. Mark froze. What do you mean, looks like you? Josh sniffled, as if holding back tears. He's wearing the same clothes I am, but the face... The connection started to fail. Josh's voice became distorted. Mark hit the computer screen trying to restore the call's location. Josh, what's wrong with his face? The answer came slowly, as if the boy was too hesitant to speak. He doesn't have a mouth. Mark felt a cold shiver run through his body. Josh, get out of that room, now. But the call started to crackle. Voices whispered in the background, something Mark couldn't make out. He shouted into the phone. Josh, can you hear me? Then, for a brief moment, he heard a noise on the line. 3 slow knocks. On the window. And then, the sound of the phone dropping to the floor. The line went silent. Mark tried to call back. Nothing. The call's location disappeared. He dispatched a unit, but due to the hurricane, it would take time for anyone to get there. When they finally arrived, they found the house destroyed. The storm had taken almost everything, but among the wreckage, they found the cordless phone still connected. The last call made? To 911. But there was no sign of Josh, not of his mother, not of anyone who could have been there that night. The house was in ruins. The wind had torn down the walls, scattered debris throughout the entire neighborhood. The unit arrived too late. No sign of Josh, no sign of his mother, no bodies, no clues. Just a cordless phone still functioning with the last call logged to 911. Mark couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, every detail, every pause, trying to find a logical explanation. But there was no logic in it. How could a child disappear without leaving a trace? Who or what was outside the window? The next morning, Mark went to the chief and asked to investigate the call's address. He knew it wasn't his job, but he couldn't let it go. He needed to know if that house really existed, if Josh really lived there. He needed something concrete to hold on to. The address led to a small coastal neighborhood, devastated by the hurricane. Houses destroyed, fallen poles, a strong smell of sea air and rotting wood in the air. Mark found what was left of the residence. The place seemed old, with exposed bricks and waterlogged remnants of furniture scattered across the floor. He approached, feeling his steps sink into the mud. That's when he saw it. On the only wall still standing, there were marks. Small marks made with a pencil, like the ones parents make to measure their children's height. And next to each mark, a name and a date. Josh, 2019. Josh, 2018. Josh, 2017. Josh, 2016. Mark furrowed his brow. Each mark showed the boy's growth year after year. He ran his fingers over the lines. They were real. But something was wrong. Just below the last mark there was another, almost erased by time, covered with dark moss. Mark knelt down and rubbed the dirt with his trembling hand until he could read what was written. Josh, 1994. He recoiled, his stomach turning. This didn't make sense. If the child was the same age in 2019, how could there be growth marks recorded in 1994? It was as if it was the same boy. The wind blew hard, whistling through the rubble. Mark felt a chill run up his spine. That's when he heard the noise. 3 slow knocks. He turned. The cordless phone was still there, lying in the debris. But now the screen was flashing. Incoming call. Mark swallowed hard and against all his instincts answered, 911, what's your emergency? For a moment there was only static. Then a soft whisper, almost like the sound of the wind. He's back. The call dropped. Mark dropped the phone and stepped back, feeling his chest tighten. This couldn't be real. But it was. He was holding the proof in his hands. That night he requested time off from work. He said he needed a break. He never answered a call again without feeling a chill down his spine. And whenever it rains heavily, he locks himself in his house, shuts the windows, and tries to ignore the sound of the storm. But sometimes he still hears the knocks, always 3 times, on the window. If I could go back in time, I would have left the city like everyone else. I would have packed my bags, shoved everything into the car, and driven as far away as possible from Hurricane Milton. But I stayed. I stayed because I thought I was smart, because I didn't want to spend money on a hotel, because the media always exaggerates. I thought it would just be another strong storm, and the next day I'd be drinking coffee on the porch, laughing at the chaos that never came. I was wrong. At first it was exactly how I predicted. The wind swayed the trees, the rain fell heavily on the roof, thunder rumbled in the distance. I grabbed a few beers, turned on a flashlight, and lay down on the couch, listening to the battery-powered radio. The evacuation warnings were still playing, but it no longer mattered. I was there, stuck until it all ended. No electricity, no neighbors, just me and the sound of the storm outside. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The wind made strange noises, whistling through the cracks, pushing branches against the walls. But the footsteps were there, slow, precise, crushing the wet earth outside my house. I got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back a little. The rain blurred everything, but that's when I saw it. A silhouette standing across the street, right in front of my house. He wasn't moving. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to do something. Maybe a lost neighbor, a latecomer who stayed behind and was now looking for shelter. But he didn't seem to be looking for anything. He was just there, staring at me. I went back to the couch, trying to ignore it. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog, a misplaced streetlight, a weird reflection. I grabbed another beer, turned my radio back on, but the footsteps came back, now closer. My skin crawled. I walked slowly to the door and locked it, even though I knew no one in their right mind would be walking outside in that storm. I went back to the window. He was still there, but now much closer. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it down the street. The light cut through the curtain of rain, and I finally got a good look at him. He was a tall man, wearing a suit. His hair was plastered to his forehead from the water. His face was too pale, eyes too dark. But something was wrong. The storm raged around him, the winds tore off signs, shattered windows, but he didn't move, not an inch. It was as if the storm didn't touch him. The flashlight flickered and went out. The battery died. I cursed under my breath and ran to grab another. When I returned to the window, he was no longer there. The rain continued to pour. The street was empty. I sighed, nervously laughing at myself. I was just paranoid. Isolation does that to you. I grabbed my backup flashlight and decided to go to sleep. Hours later, something woke me up. A repetitive sound, low, a soft but persistent tap. I sat up in bed, still groggy, trying to understand. That's when I realized. It was knocking. At my door. My lungs froze. I stayed completely still, listening. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks. Then silence. Then another 3. My mouth was dry. This didn't make sense. No one should be here. There was no one for miles. I grabbed my phone. No signal. The storm continued to batter the house, the wind howled through the cracks. But in the midst of that hell, someone, or something, was knocking on my door. I took a deep breath. Maybe it was a survivor, someone who stayed behind like me. Maybe they were cold, scared. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen earlier. I knew something was wrong. Still, my hand moved to the doorknob. I stood there, hesitating. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's voice, whispering from behind the door. "Why did you lock it?" The ground seemed to vanish beneath my feet. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the door. This wasn't possible. I lived alone. There were no children here. "Let me in." The voice was low, but it cut through the storm like a knife. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like an order. My breathing became erratic. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, threw a few things inside, and ran to the back of the house. But when I reached the back door, I froze. The doorknob turned. Someone was already trying to get in. I turned and ran to the bedroom. I locked the door, shoved the dresser against it. My chest was heaving uncontrollably. I tried to think. I tried to understand. Then I looked at the window, and there he was, the man in the rain, now in my backyard, his face pressed against the glass, smiling. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, my eyes fixed on that pale face on the other side of the glass. The man in the rain didn't blink, didn't seem to be breathing. His smile was distorted, too wide, his teeth slightly exposed, as if he were holding back a laugh. The storm raged around us, knocking down branches, but he remained there, motionless. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stare at that smile that seemed to grow bigger by the second. Suddenly he raised a hand and knocked on the glass. Knock. 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 I jumped back, stifling a scream. He knocked again. Knock. 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 The sound, muffled by the wind, reverberated in my head. Each beat made my heart race. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I opened them, he was gone. Only my reflection, pale and frightened, remained in the window. I jumped in fright as the horrible thought crossed my mind. What if he was still there? What if he was inside the house right now? I searched the room, seeing the door still blocked by the dresser, but what about the rest of the house? Slowly, I opened the door a crack. The hallway was dark, the wind whistling through the holes in the walls. Something was wrong. The air was thick, as if I were no longer alone. That was when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Wet footsteps echoing across the hardwood floor. My throat went dry. They were coming from the living room. Slowly, one step at a time, as if someone were exploring the house. My brain screamed at me to stay where I was, but my body moved on its own. I needed to see. I needed to know. I dragged the dresser and opened the door slowly, tiptoeing, trying not to make a sound. The hallway led to the living room. Rain was pouring in through a broken window, pooling on the floor, but the house was empty. Or almost. Wet footprints led from the back door to the center of the room, but then stopped suddenly, as if the person had disappeared. I swallowed hard. I scanned every corner. Nothing. But something in the reflection of the switched-off TV made me freeze. Behind me. Someone was there. I spun around quickly, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the empty house and the hurricane roaring outside. My legs shook. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, checked the still-locked front door, and ran to the back. If I could make it to my car, I could escape. Even with the storm, anything was better than staying here. When I opened the back door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The yard had been turned into a muddy swamp by the rain, but in the middle of it, standing as if waiting for me, was he. The man in the rain, his head tilted slightly to the side, his arms at his sides. His smile was there, but his eyes were now empty, like bottomless pits. He took a step forward. I took a step back, feeling my body shiver. Then, his mouth opened unnaturally, his jaw dislocating. opening wider than it should. No sound came out, only the muffled echo of the storm. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned on my heel and ran through the house, stumbling over furniture, fighting panic. He was behind me. I could feel it. I didn't need to look to know. His presence was a crushing weight, as if the air was being sucked out of me. I reached the garage, my heart pounding. The car keys were in my pocket, my hands shaking, but I managed to unlock the door. I got in the car and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the driveway. He was there, inches from the windshield. The smile was gone. Now he was just watching me, as if he was waiting for something. I accelerated full throttle, throwing the car into the rain. I drove through the yard and skidded down the street, not looking back. The hurricane was trying to swallow me, but nothing else mattered. I just had to get out of there. I just had to get away. But even after the city was behind me, even after the hurricane had faded and the sun had come out again, I could still see him. In the reflection in my rearview mirror, in the window of a cafe across the street, in the crowd standing there watching me, always there, always smiling, always waiting. I shouldn't be alive. Hurricane Milton destroyed my entire city. Houses ripped from the ground, streets turned into rivers, poles fell like twigs. I saw the sky turn black in the middle of the afternoon. I saw trees flying as if they weighed nothing. The wind screamed, not like a natural phenomenon, but like something alive, something that wanted to rip everything away from us. I managed to escape at the last minute. I grabbed my backpack and ran without looking back. The rain was so heavy that I could barely see ahead. All I knew was that I needed to get to a shelter. Any shelter. That's how I found that place. It wasn't an official shelter. There were no signs, no name on the entrance. Just an old building at the end of town, a construction that seemed to have been forgotten by time. But the door was unlocked, and when I went in, I saw that other people were already there. There were about 15 people in total. Some huddled on old mattresses, others sitting on the floor, eyes wide, faces pale. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows, vibrating the walls. But inside, it was dry and safe. At least, that's what I thought. At first, no one said much. Everyone was too scared to talk. I sat next to a middle-aged woman and a boy who looked like her son. She held his hand tightly, as if she was afraid to let go. Time passed slowly. My clothes were soaked and a musty smell permeated the air. I tried not to think about what I had lost, what I had left behind. I just had to survive the night. Then someone disappeared. It happened quickly. An old man who had been lying in the corner was simply gone. At first I thought he had gone to the bathroom, but when I went to look, the hallway was empty. I told the others, but no one seemed willing to react. The woman next to me just shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. The boy tugged at her shirt and whispered something. She simply replied, "Stay quiet." Something was wrong in that shelter. I looked around. The building was large but old. The roof creaked under the weight of the rain. The light bulbs flickered from time to time, casting long shadows across the walls. Another scream. I turned around instantly, but all I saw was emptiness. Where a man had been sitting, now only clothes were thrown on the floor, still damp from the storm. People began to move. Some murmured among themselves. Others avoided looking at each other. Panic was growing in the air, but no one did anything. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice louder than necessary. "Has anyone seen him?" Silence. The woman next to me held her son in her arms and said, "That's how it goes." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean by that?" She didn't answer. The storm outside got even worse. The wind slammed against the windows, making the glass shake. The entire building groaned under the force of the gale. And then, I heard it. A whisper, coming from the end of the hallway. It was low, almost imperceptible amidst the noise of the rain, but it was there. Indecipherable words, as if someone was whispering directly into my head. I stood up slowly. My instincts screamed at me not to go there, but something was pulling me forward. A step, Another. Someone grabbed my arm. The woman. Her eyes were wide. Her voice came out in a threat of desperation. "Don't go." I swallowed hard. "What's in there?" She shook her head. "Don't look." But it was too late. I had already looked. At the end of the hallway, where before there was nothing, there was now a half-open door, and behind it, only darkness, and a still silhouette, watching me. The silhouette didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. The storm was raging outside, shaking the walls, but here, in that dark hallway, everything seemed suffocatingly silent. The woman next to me held my arm tightly, her fingers digging into my skin. "Don't go," she repeated, her voice cracking. But I already knew there was no turning back. The open door at the end of the hallway seemed to be calling me. The silhouette remained standing there, motionless, as if waiting for something. The air around it felt wrong. The light flickered, and for an instant I caught a glimpse of a face, but it wasn't human. The woman next to me pulled her son closer. She was shaking. "This happens every time," she whispered. "Every time someone comes into that shelter." I swallowed hard. "Every time what?" She didn't answer. She just lowered her head and held the boy close to her chest. I looked around. The other people were also quiet, staring at the ground, as if ignoring it was the only way to escape. As if they already knew that if they looked for too long, if they recognized that presence, it would already be too late. But I had already looked. And now, it knew I was there. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and the silhouette disappeared. The air grew heavier. Moisture seemed to accumulate in my lungs. The hallway, previously empty, now seemed too narrow. The door at the end creaked, opening a little wider. Then came the sound, a shuffling of feet coming from within the darkness. Someone was leaving, or something. The woman tugged on my arm once more. "If you run now, you might have time." My throat was dry. Time for what? To get out. But deep down, I already knew there was no way out. My eyes fixed on the open door. The hallway seemed darker, deeper. With each flicker of the lights, darkness seemed to draw near. The sound of shuffling feet grew louder. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The storm outside seemed to vanish. There was no more wind, no more thunder, no more rain. Just absolute, suffocating silence, as if the world had ceased to exist. And a breath, right next to my ear. I froze. My eyes widened, but I couldn't move. The cold air brushed the back of my neck as if something was right behind me. I could feel its presence. I knew that if I turned my head, I would see it, but I didn't want to see it. A shiver ran down my spine, my muscles locked. I could hear the blood pounding in my temples. Then, something touched my shoulder. That was the moment I lost control. I screamed and threw myself forward, tripping over my own feet. The lights flickered violently. The people in the shelter began to scream. Something was moving down the hallway, too fast, too big. I ran. I ran without thinking, without looking back. I passed people, mattresses, windows fogged by the storm. I reached the front door. I grabbed the doorknob and tried to open it. It was locked. I knocked hard. My screams echoed through the shelter. "Open! For the love of God, open!" No one came. Behind me, footsteps, slow, precise. Something was approaching. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I knocked again, forced the doorknob, pushed the door with my shoulder. That was when I realized. The storm had stopped. The shelter was completely silent. My chest rose and fell uncontrollably. I turned my head slowly, and I saw. The people were no longer screaming. They were standing still, lined up in the middle of the room, all of them looking at me, all still, all smiling. I trembled from head to toe. "Why are you still trying to leave?" a voice asked. My mouth went dry. It was the boy, the woman's son. He took a step forward. His smile felt wrong, too far from his cheeks. "You're already here." The light flickered one last time, and everything went dark. By the time the storm hit, I had been hiding for hours. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was on the run. I had made mistakes, bad choices, and now the police were after me. Milton was my last chance. While everyone else was fleeing the city because of the hurricane, I was going the other way. In the midst of the chaos, no one would pay attention to a guy covered in blood driving a stolen car. I followed the flooded road until I found an abandoned house on the edge of a field. It looked perfect. The peeling wood indicated that no one had lived there for a long time. I parked behind some bushes, broke down the back door, and ducked inside. The storm raged outside. The wind was so strong that it made the walls vibrate, as if the house were breathing. My wet shoes left footprints in the dust on the floor. Everything smelled of mold and rotting wood. I didn't care. I just needed a safe place to wait out the storm. The house had an old couch and a fireplace full of ashes. I searched the rooms. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, one with a broken window, the other with a locked closet. The basement was too dark for me to risk going in. I closed all the doors and threw myself on the couch. The portable radio I'd stolen from a store still worked. I turned it on, turning the dials until I found a station. Just static. I leaned my head back, listening to the wind howling outside. The radio crackled, but beneath the noise, something made me open my eyes. A whisper. I turned the volume down. I sat up slowly. The house creaked as if it were moving in the wind. But that wasn't it. There was something else. A faint voice almost swallowed up by the sound of the storm. Someone was there. My body tensed. I grabbed the knife I had in my pocket and slowly stood up. I walked silently across the room, my footsteps sinking into the damp carpet. The house was large, full of shadows. "Is anyone there?" My voice sounded strange over the sound of the rain. No answer. I searched the kitchen, then the dining room. Nothing. Maybe it was the wind blowing through the cracks. Maybe it was paranoia. Or maybe not. I went back to the couch, but this time I sat up, listening. The radio was still hissing. With each gust of wind, the house shook as if it were going to collapse. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. They came from upstairs. My hand tightened on the knife. I turned slowly, staring at the dark staircase that led to the bedrooms. My mind tried to find explanations. Wood creaking, some animal trapped in the ceiling. But deep down, I already knew. I wasn't alone. I climbed slowly, each step creaking under my feet. The hallway was narrow, the air heavier than before. I looked into the first bedroom. Empty. The window rattled in the wind, scattering papers across the floor. I turned to the other room. The door was closed, and on the other side, something was scratching at the wood. My breathing became ragged. I gripped the knife tighter. I took a step forward, then another. My hand touched the cold doorknob. I could hear my own pulse. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for the closet, the one that had been locked when I arrived. Now it was open. The wide open doors revealed only darkness inside. No clothes, no furniture. Just a black space, too deep to be a regular closet. The smell was strong. Damp, rotting wood. Something else. Something that made me cover my nose with my hand. Then I saw the marks on the floor. Footprints leading from the closet. Wet. Like someone had just walked out. I jumped away, my heart pounding. I spun on my heel, ready to run. But before I could take another step, I heard a noise behind me, the closet door creaking, slamming shut. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I ran down the hall, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The radio was still blaring as I passed the living room. I grabbed my backpack and ran to the front door. Locked. I hadn't locked it. I turned to the back door, also locked. My breathing became uncontrollable. I ran to the window and tried to open it. Nothing. That's when I realized. The house wasn't shaking anymore. The wind was still roaring outside, but inside, absolute silence. And then, a new sound. Footsteps upstairs. Someone was walking down the hall, slowly, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. My body froze. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but there was no way out. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. The house was too dark for me to see, but I felt it. He was there, waiting. And then he began to descend, one step at a time. The first step creaked. My heart felt like it was going to come out of my mouth. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only listen. Another step. My breath became short. The house was dark, the air heavy with damp. The smell of rotting wood was stronger, as if something was deteriorating inside. One more step. I had to get out. Now I tried the door again. Nothing. I grabbed a chair and threw it against the window, but the glass didn't break. The sound echoed through the house, mixing with the noise of the storm. The footsteps stopped. My skin crawled all over. He knew I was trying to escape. The darkness on the stairs seemed deeper. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The weight of his presence, the feeling of being watched. Then he moved. Fast. His steps, which had been slow, became a run. A chill ran down my spine, a primitive instinct that screamed at me to run. I ran into the kitchen, stumbling over furniture. Behind me, the footsteps were erratic, heavy, like something large was coming down the stairs anyway. The kitchen was dark, but I remembered what I had seen before. The back door was locked, but what about the basement? Bad idea. But it was the only one I had. I ran to the basement door and pulled it hard. It creaked open. The smell that rose from it was worse than anything. Mold, wet earth, something sweet and rotten. But I had no choice. I ran down the steps without thinking, my feet stomping against the old wood, bracing myself against the cold walls. The basement was a dark hole, colder than the rest of the house. I threw myself against the back wall and held my breath. Silence. I couldn't see a thing. The only light came from a crack in the basement door, a thin line illuminating the top of the stairs. Then a shadow covered the light. He was there. My stomach was in knots. My head was spinning. My chest was rising and falling uncontrollably. The silence lasted too long. Then something started coming down the stairs. But it wasn't like a man walking. It was an uneven sound. Scratching. Like nails dragging on wood. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding too hard. The shadow on the stairs moved erratically. He wasn't walking. He was crawling. My throat tightened. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to pretend he wasn't there. But then I heard the voice. Low, ragged. Why did you come into my house? I froze. The voice was coming from all sides. It was like the words were being breathed straight into my head. Then another sound. Breathing. Very close. The darkness in front of me was absolute, but I knew he was there. I could feel it. The air grew colder. Then he whispered again. Do you want to go out? My blood ran cold. Yes. Yes, for God's sake, yes. But I couldn't answer. My legs were stuck in place. My body wouldn't respond. Silence swallowed everything once more. The storm seemed distant now. The house seemed gone. All I could feel was that thing in front of me, breathing slowly. Then something cold touched my wrist. I screamed and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not looking back. My body finally responded. I burst through the basement door, stumbled into the kitchen, and ran into the living room. The front door was open. Open. I wasted no time. I crossed the threshold and ran outside, my skin crawling, my mind screaming at me not to look back. The wind howled. The storm was still raging, but I didn't stop. I ran to the road, my chest burning. The rain was pounding my face. My stolen car was still there. I scrambled in, slammed the door, and tried to start the ignition with shaking hands. The engine sputtered. My heart stopped. Come on, come on, come on. The engine finally started. The car lurched forward, and then I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was there, lost in the storm. And on the porch, standing, looking at me, was he. Tall, thin. His face was too pale to be human. He didn't run. He didn't try to follow me. He just smiled. A smile that was too wide. And he waved, as if to say that this story wasn't over yet. I just wanted to get out of there. Hurricane Milton was destroying everything. The storm was advancing through Texas like a monster, swallowing entire cities, leaving a trail of chaos. The highways were clogged with cars trying to escape. People were desperate, horns honking nonstop, the radio telling them to get out as fast as possible. My wife was asleep in the passenger seat. My 5-year-old daughter, Emily, was in the car seat in the back, hugging her stuffed rabbit. The radio was only picking up static. My cell phone had no signal. All I had was the empty road in front of me and a warning in my mind, don't stop. But then, I saw it. In the middle of the field, among the crops that were swaying in the wind, there was someone, a child. I tensed up immediately. I looked in the rearview mirror, checking to see if my wife was still asleep. Emily, too. I was the only one seeing that. I took my foot off the accelerator. The child was standing there, alone, staring at the road. The headlights illuminated her frail body. She wore a white dress, her feet bare. Her black hair stuck to her face, wet from the rain. My chest tightened. The hurricane was coming. There was no way anyone could be there. My mind tried to find explanations. Had some family fleeing and left her behind? But who would leave a child alone in the middle of nowhere? I had to do something. I pulled the car over to the side of the road. I looked at my wife and Emily again. They were both still asleep, exhausted from the trip. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The wind almost knocked me over. The rain hit my skin like needles. I curled up and walked to the side of the road. "Hey, honey, are you okay?" The girl didn't answer. She didn't move. She just stared. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. "Where are your parents?" I yelled. No answer. The girl blinked slowly, and then she took a step forward. That's when I realized. Her feet wouldn't sink into the mud. My heart raced. A cold chill ran down my spine. Another step. My muscles locked. Instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Another step. The rain pounded down, soaking her white dress. But something was wrong with the fabric. It wouldn't absorb the water. "Dad?" My breath stopped. The whisper came from the back seat. Emily was awake. I turned around. She was sitting in the car seat, eyes wide, staring at the girl in the field. "Dad," her voice shook. "She wants to come in." The air was knocked out of my lungs. I turned back to the road. The girl was closer. I could see her face now. My stomach turned. Her skin was too pale. Her eyes were too big. The mouth didn't move, but I heard her voice. "Let me in." I felt a chill in my chest. My instinct finally screamed, "Run." I took a step back, almost tripping. I turned on my heel and ran to the car. "Emily, close your eyes," I yelled, getting into the driver's seat and slamming the door. My fingers shook as I turned the key. The engine took a while to start. The girl was on the side of the road now. I stopped breathing. She didn't walk over. She just appeared. The engine started. I accelerated. The wheels skidded in the mud, but I managed to get back on the road. The car rocked in the wind. The storm raged around us, but I didn't look back. Emily was sobbing softly in the back seat. My wife woke up startled. "What happened?" My mouth was dry. Nothing. I didn't say anything. But in the rearview mirror, I saw something that took my breath away. The girl was still there, standing in the field, moving, looking, and smiling. The car skidded on the wet road. My fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel. My mind screamed at me not to look in the rearview mirror, but I looked and saw her standing there in the field, still motionless, still staring, the storm swirling around her without moving a hair. And then Emily spoke again, her voice shaky and low, saying she was coming, saying she wanted to come in. And I felt a chill run up my spine because I knew that no matter how hard I sped up, no matter how fast I ran away, she would always be too close. My wife woke up to the jolt of the car and asked what was wrong, but my mouth was dry and I couldn't answer. My eyes were glued to the mirror, waiting for the next flash of the storm. And when the lightning lit up the road again, she was no longer there in the field. She was closer, now on the shoulder, standing in the mud without sinking. her white dress without a single stain, and I wanted to believe it was a delusion, but Emily whispered, "A father." That made me. I realized that she saw it too, that she knew that it wasn't all in my head. And then came the knocking on the window. 3 dry, low knocks, as if someone wanted to come in without rushing, without urgency, just waiting for me to make the mistake of looking. And then came the voice, low, drawn out, impossible to be swallowed by the sound of the storm, impossible to ignore. "Let me in." My whole body shivered. My wife grabbed my arm, asking who was knocking on the window in the middle of a deserted road in the middle of a hurricane. But I knew I couldn't answer. I knew that if I said it out loud, it would become even more real. So I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and accelerated. I felt the car rock. I saw the streetlights flashing and going out as we passed them. And for a moment I thought we were escaping, that the thing was behind us, but that's when Emily whimpered and pointed to the back seat. My heart almost stopped. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the silhouette of someone sitting next to her, still staring forward, eyes too black to be human, skin too white. And then that thing smiled, and before I could react, the car skidded, spun on the road, hit something I couldn't see, and everything became a blur of rain and darkness. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the smell of wet earth and gasoline. My head was pounding. The car was on its side, the doors were open, the storm was raging around us, but there was no sound inside the vehicle, and when I looked at the passenger seat, my wife was gone. When I looked at the back seat, Emily was gone either, and then despair hit me full on. I stumbled out of the car, the mud swallowing my feet, my whole body shaking. I called out to them. I screamed until my throat hurt, but the only sound I heard was the wind, the rain, the empty echo of my own terror. And then, in the middle of the field, between the fog and the darkness, I saw a small silhouette holding a stuffed rabbit, standing still, motionless, looking at me. Emily. My legs moved before my mind could process it. I ran towards her, stumbling, slipping, feeling the cold of the storm soaking my body. But when I got close enough to see her face, something inside me broke. She smiled, a smile that was wrong, too wide, too dark. "Let me in." I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my chest. That thing was using my daughter's body, but it wasn't her. Her eyes were too deep, too empty, deep like black holes, as if everything I knew was being sucked into them. Then I felt something cold touch my arm. I froze to the bone. I turned my face slowly, breathless, voiceless, and saw my wife beside me, her hair drenched in water, her clothes soaked, her skin pale and dead, her eyes wide and soulless. And when her mouth opened, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a slurred whisper, repeating the same words over and over again. New, "Let me in, let me in, let me in." My mind screamed at me to run, but my body didn't respond. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The storm was swirling around me. I could feel their presence getting closer, the smell of wet earth and rotten things getting stronger and stronger. And that's when I realized they were never trapped outside. I was the one trapped inside. This story that I am going to tell you was told to me by my great-grandfather, who has already passed away when I was a child. And since then I have never forgotten it, because the way he looked at me when he finished the story made my whole body shiver. And even after all these years, I still think about it when I am alone in the dark. It was the early morning of April 18th, 1906, and my great-grandfather, James Callahan, was 19 years old when the earth began to shake, at first as a weak vibration, almost imperceptible, but that in seconds transformed into something monstrous. The ground cracking, the buildings breaking apart, the dust swallowing everything while people screamed, running without knowing where, trying to escape from what could not be escaped because the world itself was crumbling beneath their feet. He saw houses sinking, windows exploding, poles falling like twigs, and the worst of all was the sound. A deep roar coming from beneath the earth, as if something gigantic was waking up down there. And when the shaking finally stopped, the city was unrecognizable, streets buried, fires starting everywhere, and a heavy silence hanging in the air, as if everything was waiting for the final blow. But there was no time to think about what had happened. because there were still people alive, trapped under the rubble, screaming for help. And that was why my great-grandfather joined a group of volunteers excavating the ruins of a 3-story hotel where dozens of guests were buried. And while they were digging, removing blocks of stone and pieces of wood soaked in blood, they heard a sound that made everyone stop at the same time. 3 knocks low, weak, coming from somewhere in the middle of the rubble. My great-grandfather held his breath, trying to locate where it was coming from, and then he heard it again. 3 spaced, desperate knocks, and one of the volunteers shouted, asking if anyone was there, but there was no answer, only more knocks, each time weaker. And that was when they began to dig with everything, because they knew they didn't have much time. My great-grandfather used his bare hands, pulling out rocks, smelling the dust and burning flesh, while sweat ran down his face, mixed with the soot from the fire that consumed the city. And after almost half an hour, they opened a hole between the broken beams, and in the middle of the darkness, there was a man looking at them. He was trapped up to his chest, covered in dust and blood, his eyes wide with pure despair. But what made my great-grandfather retreat was not that, but his smile. Because he smiled. But it wasn't a smile of relief. It wasn't a smile of someone who had been saved. It was wrong, too wide, frozen on his face in a way that didn't seem natural. And my great-grandfather felt a deep shiver, something inside him screaming that this wasn't right. And then one of the volunteers knelt down beside him and shouted to the man that they were going to get him out of there, asking if he was okay. But the man didn't answer. He kept smiling. That's when it happened. The worst. The ground shook again. It wasn't a strong earthquake, just a light, quick tremor, but enough for all the volunteers to throw themselves back, thinking that more rubble would fall. And for a moment, everything was covered in dust again. And when the dust settled, the man was gone. My great-grandfather felt his blood run cold. The beams, the stone blocks, everything was exactly as before. Nothing had collapsed. Not a single stone had been moved. But the hole they had opened was now empty, with no sign of anyone there, no body, no blood, nothing. His breathing became irregular, his heart hammering in his chest, trying to understand how that was possible. But he didn't have the courage to say anything, didn't have the courage to ask the others if they had seen it too, because deep down he knew that they had. He knew that everyone there was feeling the same fear, and when they looked at each other, no one said a word. They just got up, walked away from the rubble, and never came back. My great-grandfather lived many years after that, but whenever he told this story, his voice would shake at the end. And the last time he told it to me, he looked me in the eyes and said something I've never forgotten. Since that day, every time I'm alone in the dark, I hear the knocking. The knocking never stopped. My great-grandfather said he tried to forget, tried to move on with his life after the earthquake. But something stayed with him, something that no one else seemed to notice, something that would make him wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, hearing that distant sound, that ringing, 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 that echoed in his mind like a warning, as if someone was still trapped down there, calling, waiting to be found again. But he never returned to the site of the collapse. No one returned. The hotel was swallowed up in the fire that swept through the city after the earthquake, and ash covered what was left of the rubble, making it impossible to know how many people were still buried inside. But my great-grandfather said that some things don't go away. Some things get stuck. And when San Francisco began to rebuild, he learned that the same lot where the hotel stood now housed a new building, a building he avoided at all costs. Years passed, but the sound of the knocking never went away. Sometimes he was home alone, in the absolute silence of the early morning, and he felt a vibration in the ground, something faint, something distant, something that no one else seemed to hear. And when everything was quiet enough, the sound would come back, ringing, ringing, ringing. At first, he tried to find the source, tried to tell himself that it was just an old pipe, a neighbor walking upstairs, but no matter where he moved to, no matter where he was, the knocking always came back, always at the same rhythm, always at the same intensity, and always when he was alone. One night, many years after the earthquake, he was walking home from work when, without realizing it, he turned down the wrong street and found himself standing in front of the building that had been built on the ruins of the old hotel. His heart immediately started racing. The building was tall, imposing, with windows shining against the darkness of the city. But something was wrong because he swore that for an instant he saw a man standing on the top floor, looking down at him, a man in dark clothes, thin, motionless, and even from afar, even in the middle of the night, he knew that the man was smiling. My great-grandfather turned to leave, but before he could take the first step, he heard the knocks, knock, 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 coming from the ground. His body froze, his breath caught, and then he realized that he was right over the place where the man had been buried years ago, exactly there, where he had seen him for the first time, where he had lost sight of him, where no one had ever found anything again. And then he heard a voice, low, hoarse, coming from under the ground. "You found me." The world seemed to spin around him, and for a second he felt like the ground was giving way. He felt like he was sinking, like invisible hands were closing around him, pulling him down. And when he finally managed to move, he ran as if something was behind him, ran without looking back, without caring about anything other than getting out of there. Because he knew he shouldn't be there. He never went back to that street. He never looked at that building again, and he never spoke about it to anyone again. But even after he was old, even after so many years, every time he was alone, in the middle of the night, in absolute silence, he still heard the knocking. And every time it happened, he closed his eyes and prayed that this time no one would knock back. I never liked San Francisco, and after what happened to me, I never went back there. In 2006, on the centennial of the earthquake that destroyed the city, my company sent me to cover a special event about the historic buildings that survived the disaster, and even though I didn't like the idea, I accepted, because I never imagined that this trip would change my life, or worse, that something had been waiting for me for over a century in that place. I stayed at the Claremont Hotel, one of the few buildings that survived the 1906 earthquake without suffering almost any damage. And on the first day I realized that there was something strange there, a heaviness in the air, a feeling that I wasn't alone, a silence in the hallways even when the hotel was full of guests, as if the building itself was holding its breath, as if it was waiting for something. The first night was peaceful, at least until 3:12 in the morning. I woke up for no reason, feeling a strange cold on my skin, even with the heater on. And it was then that I realized that the door to my room was open, not wide open, but ajar enough for me to see the dark hallway outside. And at the same time my stomach turned, because I was absolutely certain that I had locked the door before going to sleep. I got up slowly, trying to calm my mind, telling myself that maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe I was too tired from the trip, maybe it was all just in my head. But when I went to the door to close it, I felt something that made the air leave my lungs. The smell of smoke, but not cigarettes, not fireplaces. It was the smell of burning wood, of old things on fire. And the next second I heard a noise coming from the end of the hallway, the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot across the carpet. But the entire hotel was silent, and I knew that no one else was awake at that hour. My fingers gripped the doorknob tightly, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment I thought about calling out to someone. But then the footsteps stopped, right in front of me bedroom. My mouth went dry, my muscles locked, and before I could pull away, I felt a cold wind rush past me, as if someone had just come in, but there was no one there, at least no one I could see. The door closed on its own. The lock turned, and the smell of smoke grew even stronger. My entire body shivered, my ears throbbed from the heavy silence around me, and then, out of nowhere, the phone rang. The sound made me jump. My hand trembled as I answered it, and the moment I put the receiver to my ear, what I heard made my blood run cold, a low, staticky hiss, and beneath the noise, breathing. It wasn't a normal sound. It was something irregular, clipped, as if the person on the other end was struggling to speak. And then, after a few seconds, I finally heard a voice, weak, scratchy. "Get out while you can." Before I could react, the line was disconnected. The phone went dead. And then, the building shook. The lights flickered, The floor vibrated, the glasses on the table rattled, and for a moment I felt like the earth was moving again, like the earthquake was happening all over again. And then silence returned. The smell of smoke disappeared, and the hotel became too quiet. But I knew I was no longer alone in that room. The room seemed to breathe around me. The silence was thick, almost palpable, as if something were hidden inside it, watching. My entire body was shivering, my throat dry, my eyes fixed on the door. Something told me that if I left now, I could escape. But I didn't. My fingers were still holding the phone, the silent sound on the other end echoing in my head. The message repeated like a warning, "Get out while you can." Then the lights flickered again. The tremor was so subtle that I almost thought I had imagined it, but no. The glass of water on the table vibrated slightly as if someone had run past me. The smell of smoke returned, but this time it was coming from inside the room. The mirror next to the bed fogged up as if someone was breathing right next to it. I took a step back, trying to control my racing pulse, but it was then that I heard the sound of footsteps. Not in the hallway. Inside the room. I was alone. At least, that's what it should have been. But the footsteps were clear, slow, the carpet creaking softly under an invisible weight. My chest rose and fell uncontrollably, my legs locked. Then a sharp knock came from the door. Once, twice, 3 times. My heart froze. Should I open it? My instinct screamed at me not to touch the doorknob, not to let in whatever was on the other side, but I didn't need to open the door to know that something was already inside. The phone rang again. The sound echoed through the room and made my skin crawl. I answered it with shaking hands, unable to say anything. The line crackled as before. Then the voice whispered again, this time clearer. "It's happening again." The building shook violently. The ground shifted beneath my feet and a deafening noise came from the hallway, like walls collapsing. I ran to the door and pulled hard on the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The shaking grew more intense. The light bulbs exploded and the mirror cracked from top to bottom. And then, as if time were folding in on itself, I saw it. The hallway was no longer the same. The elegant carpet was gone. The walls were covered in cracks and ash. Thick dust filled the air, the smell of burning permeating everything. People ran in despair, their clothes covered in blood and soot. The screams were loud, inhuman, mixed with the rumble of the earthquake that had happened 100 years ago. In the midst of all the destruction, someone was standing, a thin man wearing period clothing, pale skin, his face covered in dirt and cuts. He was still, but his eyes were fixed on mine. Slowly, he smiled. A wrong smile, too wide, his teeth stained with blood. "It's happening again," the voice on the phone repeated. The world spun. The shaking suddenly stopped. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and everything went silent again. When I looked back into the hallway, it was empty. The hotel was normal again. The mirror was still cracked. The glass of water still shook. But there were no more screams, no more dust, no more ash. My body was shaking when I finally managed to open the door. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, past the reception desk, and out into the street. The cold early morning air hit me, and only then did I realize I was sweating. I never went back to the Clermont Hotel, and every time I hear about an earthquake, I remember what I saw that night. Because I know it wasn't a vision of the past. It was a warning. The earthquake will happen again. Not everyone died in the earthquake, but some never made it out. My grandfather was a firefighter and spent his life telling stories about the fires he had fought, but there was one he never liked to talk about. I only found out about it because years ago I found an old diary hidden in the basement of his house. The pages were yellowed, covered in soot, the handwriting shaky, scribbled as if it had been written in a hurry. And among the accounts of rescues and destruction, one of them took my breath away. It was from 1906, right after the earthquake that destroyed San Francisco. The city was in ruins, but the worst part wasn't the tremor. The worst came later. The fire. The flames spread quickly, consuming everything the earthquake hadn't destroyed. And in the middle of that inferno, As the firefighters tried to save those still trapped in the rubble, my grandfather wrote about a call that should never have happened. A voice coming from inside the fire. On the morning of April 21st, 1906, he and other firefighters were dispatched to a hotel that was still burning. It was too late to save the building, but some people might still be alive on the lower floors. They had little time before the place would collapse completely. The smoke was suffocating. The heat made the air shimmer like a distorted mirror. And then he heard it. "Someone help me." The voice came from the second floor, faint, choked, a woman. He turned to the crew chief, but no one else seemed to have heard. The noise of the fire was loud, the ceiling creaking, the wood cracking, but the voice came clear as a whisper in his ear. "Please, help me." He didn't think. He grabbed the axe and climbed the stairs. The fire roared around him, but he guided himself by the voice, by the low cry that seemed to grow closer and closer. And then he saw the door. A room at the end of the hall, smoke billowing from beneath it, soft tapping against the wood. Someone was inside. He prepared to break in. But before he could touch the doorknob, it turned on its own. The door swung open slowly, and for a second, he saw only darkness. The fire hadn't yet consumed the room. The air was heavy, and smoke hung from the ceiling like a blanket of ash. In the shadows, there was a woman. Standing in the corner of the room, her back to him, her disheveled hair falling over her ancient dress. She was shaking, her shoulders rising and falling in quiet sobs. "Madam," he called, but she didn't answer. He stepped inside, sweat streaming down his face, his throat burning with heat. He reached out to touch her shoulder. That was when she turned her face. Not her whole body, just her face. More than she should have. The bones in his neck twisted at an impossible angle, his eyes hollow, his skin burned raw. And then he smiled. The fire roared behind him. The floor groaned, the ceiling gave way, and everything went black. The ceiling caved in. The heat of the fire became unbearable. The smoke filled his lungs, suffocating, sticky, scratching at his throat as if he were breathing in living ash. He tried to move, but something was pulling him back, the weight of the air becoming solid around him, as if invisible hands were closing in on him. And then, amid the roar of the wood splitting and the flames engulfing the room, he heard it. The voice, low, drawn out, like a choked whisper in the heat. "Don't let the fire go out." His body froze, despite the inferno around him. He tried to look around, his eyes burning, but the smoke made everything a blur. Whatever was in that room with him was no longer a woman in danger. He knew that now. The wrong smile, the twisted neck, the empty eyes. It wasn't human. He had to get out. He forced his body to react, staggering backward. But the room seemed larger now, the flames farther away, as if he were being pulled into a space that had never existed before. The heat had changed. It was no longer the heat of real fire. It was something deep, alive, burning not just his skin, but something inside him, a heat that came not from outside, but from within. He tried to scream, but his voice would not come out. The woman's shadow moved, not walking, floating. She glided toward him without moving her feet, her burned dress fluttering around her, her eyes sinking deeper into the darkness. Her mouth opened, far wider than was possible, and from her throat came a sound that was not a scream, but the crackle of live embers, the crackle of burning wood, the breath of something that should never have a voice. "Don't let the fire go out." The door behind him slammed shut, locking him inside that hell. The heat grew. He felt the skin on his hands burning, his hair singeing on his forehead, his clothes starting to stick to his skin. Then he saw something on the floor. Footprints. Wet. They shouldn't have been there. The fire was burning everything. There was no water, and yet the marks led to him. Small traces of footsteps from someone who had entered there before him. And when he realized this, a cold took over his body, a fear that went beyond the terror of the fire, because he understood. It wasn't trapped in the fire. He was the one. The woman's shadow bent over him, and before he could react, something pushed him hard against the wall. His chest tightened, the air escaped his lungs, and in the same instant, the fire died. Everything went black. The smell of burning disappeared. The heat disappeared. The rumble of the building falling stopped. The silence was absolute, an emptiness where not even his heart seemed to beat. He tried to move his fingers, to feel the ground beneath him, but there was nothing. It was as if he were suspended in a place that didn't exist. Then something touched his shoulder, cold, wet. The fingers closed around his skin, and before he could see what it was, the light came back on. He was in the middle of the street. The hotel behind him was still burning, but the firefighters were running around, throwing water on the flames, shouting commands. The chaos continued as if nothing had happened. His body was soaked, his clothes wet, his skin cold as if he had stepped out of a frozen river. He fell to his knees. Someone pulled him up, shaking his shoulders. One of the other firefighters was shouting his name. "What happened? You're gone! We've looked for you on every floor, but we haven't found anything." He couldn't answer. He looked back. The building was about to collapse. Flames danced in the windows, but on the second floor, in the same room where it all happened, he saw it. She was still there, standing in the dark, between the curtains of fire. Her face distorted, her smile wrong. And before the building collapsed completely, she opened her mouth for the last time and whispered, "Don't let the fire go out." My great-grandmother told me this story when I was still a child, and I have never forgotten it. She was already quite old when she sat with me on a rainy afternoon and held my hands tightly, her eyes distant as if she were seeing something beyond the present. And she said that there were things that should not be told, but that I needed to know. She said that the 1906 earthquake destroyed San Francisco, but that for some people, it never ended. She was just a girl at the time. She was 7 years old when the earth opened up beneath her feet and the whole world seemed to collapse on top of her. Her family lived near Market Street in a small house that collapsed like all the others that morning. And what came next was even worse. The fire, the screams, the smell of burning flesh mixed with the dust. My great-grandmother was dragged by the crowd, separated from her parents and taken to one of the makeshift refugee camps that sprang up in the following days. It was there that something happened that would mark her life forever. The camp was in a large park, with hundreds of makeshift tents and people wandering like ghosts, homeless, without food, waiting for help that was slow to arrive. She stayed with other children who had also been lost in the disaster, but hunger and exhaustion were so great that no one spoke much. Then, on the third night, the earth shook again. It wasn't a tremor like the first, nothing so strong as to bring down what was left of the city. It was something small, subtle, a tremor that ran through the ground as if something was moving underground. The tent shook, some people woke up startled, but soon everything returned to silence. My great-grandmother huddled in the dirty blanket they had given her, trying to sleep again. But then she heard it, knocking, faint, spaced out, seeming to come from underground. She opened her eyes slowly and turned to see if anyone else had heard it, but no one was moving. They were just sleeping, exhausted. She thought it might have been a dream, her fatigue playing tricks on her mind. But then the knocking came again, a dull, muffled subterranean tapping, as if someone were punching the earth down there. She tried to ignore it, squeezing her eyes tightly, but the knocking continued, getting closer and closer. Something inside her told her not to move, not to look, but her fear and curiosity were stronger. Very slowly, she sat up on the makeshift mattress and peered out of the tent. The camp was plunged into darkness. The fires had gone out, the smoke still rising in the cold, early morning air. Everything seemed normal. But then she saw it. In the middle of the camp, a person was kneeling on the ground. It was a woman, her long hair covering her face, her clothes dirty with dust, her skin so pale it almost glowed under the moon. Her hands were flat on the ground, her fingers sinking into the mud as if she were listening to the earth. And then, suddenly, she turned her head toward my great-grandmother. But her eyes weren't right. There was something dark in them, something too deep, a void that reflected no light. Her mouth opened slowly, too slowly, and she whispered something so softly that the wind almost carried the words away. "He's still shaking." My great-grandmother couldn't breathe. She stood there, her muscles locked, unable to move, until she felt the ground vibrate again. The shaking was faint, but this time she realized it wasn't a normal earthquake. It was a throb. Something down there was still alive. My great-grandmother couldn't move. The air seemed trapped in her lungs, and the biting cold of the early morning made her bones ache. But nothing was worse than the woman kneeling in the mud, her fingers sinking into the earth, her mouth whispering those wrong words. "He's still shaking." She wanted to run. She wanted to close her eyes and pretend none of this was happening, but the ground shook again, and this time it didn't stop. The makeshift mattress began to vibrate beneath her, the ground pulsing as if it had its own heart, a dull, deep rhythm that didn't come from the earth, but from something inside her. The woman remained still, but her breathing was wrong, too long and too slow, as if she were breathing along with the tremor, as if she were in sync with it. Then the woman looked up, not at my great-grandmother, at the sky. Her eyes wide, her mouth open as if she were listening to something coming from above. But there was nothing there except the clouds carried by the cold wind. But she kept looking, and as the seconds passed, the expression on her face changed, from fear to acceptance. She whispered something again, but my great-grandmother couldn't understand, because it was at that moment that the tents began to move on their own, not as if they were being shaken by the wind, not as if the tremor was knocking down the poles. They were being pulled down. The canvas tore, the wooden poles sank inch by inch, and then came the first screams. People began to wake up. Some ran outside in despair, others were trapped inside the tents that sank deeper and deeper, as if the ground was trying to swallow everything inside. My great-grandmother felt her own body tilt backwards. The earth was sucking her in, her feet sinking as if she were in quicksand. She tried to scream, but the screams of the others were louder. A man stumbled beside her, fell to his knees and disappeared completely, pulled into the mud before he could react. Horror took hold of her, and she dragged herself back with her hands, trying to get out of there, trying to grab onto anything firm. But there was nothing firm. The ground was alive. The shaking was getting stronger. And then came the last rumble. It was no ordinary earthquake. It was something coming out of the earth. A huge crack opened up in the middle of the camp. Entire tents fell inside, and black smoke rose as if something was breathing after being trapped for a long time. My great-grandmother heard the cracking of the wood, the screams fading, the smell of rot invading everything. She wanted to look into the crack, but something inside her told her not to. Then she looked at the woman. She was no longer there. The ground suddenly stopped shaking, and silence was instantaneous. There were no more tents sinking, no more screams, only black smoke rising from the crack in the ground, spreading a smell that should not be there. She does not remember how she escaped. She doesn't remember who survived or who was swallowed that night. She only remembers waking up the next day in the arms of a stranger, being carried out of the camp while a group of men watched the crack close by itself, as if it had never existed. The earthquake was over for the city, but for her, never again. Because after that night, whenever she was in a very quiet place, she could hear it, the pounding in the earth, faint, slow, like a heart buried too deep, waiting to wake up again. There are voices that should never be heard, and calls that should never be answered. When I was a child, my mother always talked about the importance of never ignoring a phone call, because it might be someone asking for help. But she never heard the story I found in the archives of an old San Francisco telephone exchange. I never heard of the operator who answered a call from a place that no longer existed. In 1906, before the earthquake, all communications in the city went through manually operated exchanges. Operators spent their days connecting wires, transferring calls, listening to voices come and go, never knowing the face behind each one. And that's why, on the morning of the disaster, many of those working there didn't have time to escape. The Market Street Telephone Exchange building was one of the largest in the city, and when the earthquake started, the walls shook before anyone could even get out of their chairs. The ceiling collapsed, wires snapped, the floor opened up, and everything was sucked into a hell of stone, dust, and fire. When the survivors were rescued hours later, nearly all of the operators were dead, almost all of them. Amid the wreckage, they found a man still holding a phone to his ear, his fingers gripping the cord so tightly they had to break them to free him. His face was frozen in a look of pure terror, his eyes wide, his mouth half open as if he had tried to scream. But the strangest thing was what they found next to him. A phone line that was still active. The switchboard equipment had been destroyed, the cables ripped from the walls, and yet a single phone was still working. The rescuer who found him heard a hissing sound in the receiver and for a moment swore he heard a voice, low, choked, calling for help. But the phone fell from his hand before he could answer, and the line went dead. The story was buried along with the wreckage. No one ever explained how a call could have happened with the network destroyed, but a few years later, when a new exchange was built on the same site, the new operators began reporting something strange. Calls that no one answered, calls that came from non-existent numbers, and sometimes, when someone did work up the courage to answer, all they heard was static and muffled breathing on the other end. The calls continued. At first they were rare, something that happened once a month, an isolated ring in the middle of the night, as if a ghost number was trying to connect with a world that no longer existed. But as the years went by, the operators began to notice that every time someone answered, something worse happened. The phone always crackled before any sound came, as if there was dust inside the line, something ancient trying to cross decades to speak. Silence came first, then breathing. Slow, heavy, muffled, as if there was too much dirt covering the mouth of the person trying to speak. And then, the whisper. "Can you hear me?" That's how it started in the new telephone exchange, the same one that was built on the exact spot where the old one collapsed. At first, the employees laughed at it, thinking it was an urban legend created by the older ones, a story to scare the newbies. But on the night of April 18th, 1926, exactly 20 years after the earthquake, the legend stopped being just a story. It was a normal night shift, the dark room lit only by the dim light of the lamps hanging from the ceiling. The operator on duty was a young woman named Helen Carter, newly hired and not yet accustomed to the tedium of the early hours of the morning, when almost no one called. But that night, when the clock struck 5:12 in the morning, the phone rang. The sound echoed through the empty room, a ringing louder than it should have been, as if it were the only sound in the entire city. Helen frowned and answered, "Switchboard, how can I help you?" "Nothing. Static," she repeated. The silence on the other end seemed to stretch on too long, a vacuum where time still stood. Then came the sound. Breathing. It was no ordinary noise. It was the air escaping from the lungs of someone who was suffocating, someone desperately trying to draw in oxygen, but couldn't. "Can you hear me?" Helen froze. Her mind was telling her to hang up, but her hand wouldn't. The voice on the other end sounded muffled, low, as if the person's mouth was covered in dust, as if they were speaking from beneath rubble. She cleared her throat, trying to remain calm. "Sir, do you need help?" Silence returned. Then, something she would never forget. A sound of stone scraping against stone, something being moved, something coming out of the ground. "I'm down here." Helen couldn't breathe. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck, her eyes fixed on the wall of the switchboard, where a black and white photo showed the wreckage of the old telephone exchange just after the earthquake. Piles of broken bricks, fallen beams, and, right in the center of the image, a destroyed telephone with the receiver lying next to it. The line cracked loudly. "Can you hear me now?" Helen threw down the receiver and stepped away from the desk as if it were going to explode. But then the phone rang again. The sound filled the room, each ring louder than the last, vibrating through the floor like an echo from the past that never died. Helen covered her ears and ran. She never returned to the switchboard. That same week, the staff decided to check the old switchboard's records. They discovered that on the morning of the earthquake, the last recorded call had been answered by an operator, Thomas Redding, who had been in the building when the building collapsed. His body was never found, but the call he answered was never completed. And to this day, If you were near Market Street on April 18th at exactly 5:12 a.m., you might hear a phone ringing. But if you answer, never hang up, because the call is still active.